cover of Cyberpunk 2020, the landmark tabletop RPG created by Mike Pondsmith. It's often the phrase associated with cyberpunk as a whole, used to explain the often anachronistic and high-tech while little explained technology, world building, and aesthetic trappings of the genre. Like, why is Harrison Ford wearing this conglomerate of 80s and 40s and 2065's high fashion? Why do the shutters in this shot look the same as the ones in my shitty apartment in Metro Phoenix, while everything else looks like it's out of a spaceship? Why is everything in Japanese? I mean, how the fuck does net running work? What exactly is the engineering behind retractable fingernails? And what the fuck is a monowire? And the simple answer is... who cares? It looks fucking sweet. Style over substance. Perhaps one of the features of cyberpunk that separates it from science fiction is often the lack of explanation given to the science of the world. While science fiction works often go to great lengths to explain strange phenomena, magic systems, technology, and alien worlds, cyberpunk is usually satisfied with a physical description of the object to give you a dope-ass mental image of what it looks like in action, or a description of the setting enough to set that rain-soaked, neon-lit tech-noir mood. And it usually stops there, and it works. While the phrase style over substance is useful when playing a tabletop game, allowing the players to focus on the action-packed moments instead of sitting through tedious hours of world building by the GM, it somewhat undersells the depth cyberpunk often carries within. While on a technological or scientific level, cyberpunk often, but not always, lacks depth. It is by the discarding of the need for PhD-level lectures on how aerodynes work that the genre has an opportunity to explore what may be the more interesting facets of the setting itself, along with the societal and philosophical implications packaged within it. Magic systems and power creep. Science fiction is a fairly broad genre that can encompass quite a large number of varied settings. Outer space travel, far future or past, alien worlds, galactic warfare, and so on. Science fiction is often considered the cousin of fantasy, related by the focus on world building and magic systems. I do want to make a note here that when I say magic, that doesn't always refer to literal magic, but sometimes it does. While magic is more associated with fantasy works, consider the alternative in science fiction to usually be the advanced technology of that universe or world. Sometimes this can functionally or actually be magic, as with the biotic implants in Mass Effect or the concept of the Force in Star Wars. To tell a compelling story that involves magic or high-concept technology, it's very important to have a well-defined system with clear rules, limitations, and to avoid the infamous power creep. Now, power creep is the tendency for a long-running series, book, movie, game, television show. Sometimes it can happen within one piece of media, but typically we see this in a series. It's the tendency for the showrunners to escalate the power level of their protagonists and antagonists in order to keep raising the dramatic stakes. If the magic system isn't clearly defined, it is inevitable that things become ridiculous and ultimately quite boring. Take Avatar: The Last Airbender as an example of a robust magic system. The rules of the system are clear. There is a limited and well-defined progression of power, and the show manages to pace Aang's growth well enough to keep things from getting either too easy or too hard for him. The end result is a satisfying, tight progression that feels natural. As a counterpoint, take Naruto. Not to shit on Naruto, because I do love it oh so dearly, and it is a beloved part of my weeb childhood. However, you go from intense, strategically interesting battles of the first couple hundred episodes of the show, where characters with certain skill sets use those skills within the limits of their energy, which is chakra in the show. There's a limit to how much they can do in one battle. And they face off against enemies with very different sets of skills. The excitement from those earlier episodes comes from the planning and strategy required for each character to use their skills to their advantage in a given situation, while finding their enemy's weak point. Think Shikamaru versus Tamari or Rock Lee versus Gaara. But fast forward to the end of the series, where meteors are being chucked willy-nilly and ultimate Susanoo Tsukuyomi tail beast bombs are being spammed like the first time I played Nier Automata. It gets repetitive fast because there's nowhere to go forward from diarrhea Christmas lights in a way that isn't just more diarrhea Christmas lights. There are, generally speaking, two ways to build a good magic system, two ways to go about it, and to avoid power creep. The first is to go the route of Avatar, where you keep things pretty simple and thus can explain the rules without much difficulty.
Water, fire, air, earth.
Fucking magnets, how do they work?
In Avatar, there are 4 types of benders, 1 for each element, plus the Avatar, who can use all 4, and certain natural events on certain days that will enhance Bender's abilities. The show doesn't ever need to go out of its way to explain why Fire Lord Ozai can't just nuke the Water Nation with a giant fireball. They just don't ever let him do something similar or introduce any character with that kind of power. The expectation of power abilities are natural and implicit. You could also argue this is a motivational thing, as Fire Lord Ozai have goals that would prevent him from blowing up the world. He wants to colonize the world, not destroy it, so his power has a natural limitation on it given his character motivations. The second way to deal with tension is to explain absolutely everything, to explain exactly how things work, what the limitations and abilities of every relic and system are. Science fiction tends to fall more on this end of the spectrum, although sometimes they will go the route of, for example, Star Wars, and keep things pretty clean cut. Usually, the appeal of science fiction is largely in the world building, along with the interesting and juicy details that make the world, technologies, cultures, and systems within it compelling. While there is some form of conflict in every story, of course, many science fiction fans are drawn to the genre not because of the conflict itself, but because of the vast breadth of worlds that authors have created. Interesting cultural topics that we take a different look at because of this unique setting, and the unique systems and technologies that exist within these worlds. The conflict, again, is there, but it takes a backseat to the fleshing out of the setting itself. Fantasy often functions this way too, although usually to a lesser extent because of a more defined understanding of what fantasy is. It's pre-electronics, it's pre-engines, and pre-computers. It's usually derivative of some form of medieval style and culture, and while this can vary, it's typically based off European culture. It has recurring monsters, species, and magical elements, and it's often drawn from the works of J.R.R. Tolkien in some way. And that brings me to Cyberpunk. Cyberpunk often brings the best of both worlds together, and I fucking love it for that reason. Much like J.R.R. Tolkien basically invented the fantasy genre with The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, William Gibson basically invented cyberpunk in 1984 with the publishing of Neuromancer. The sky above the port was the color of television, tuned to a dead channel. This is the first line you read upon opening Neuromancer. It perfectly encapsulates the tone of the novel and the tone of many cyberpunk works that followed. Of course, Gibson was not the first author to scratch the surface of what would come to be known as cyberpunk. Philip K. Dick is largely credited for his work, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? It's often credited as a seminal work for cyberpunk, and then Neuromancer solidified the meaning of the genre. Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson also became another important bastion of the genre, coming out in 1992, and further solidified its identity. What Dick Gibson Stevenson did was to lay the circuitry, so to speak, for the genre, and moreover the setting of cyberpunk as a whole. This written atmosphere would soon become visual upon the release of Blade Runner, which is based on Dick's novel and directed by Ridley Scott, Akira, and Johnny Mnemonic. Soon, it would become interactive, following Cyberpunk's gaming debut with Shadowrun, System Shock, and Deus Ex. And of course, Cyberpunk 2020. Now, I plan on delving into these works much deeper in other videos, but we're not here to focus on these works in isolation. Perhaps I'm alone here, but I feel that the setting, tone, and themes of Cyberpunk are more seductive than any one work on its own. Cyberpunk was born of the 80s. It was born of the policies of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. It was an 80s vision of the relatively near future, where neoliberalism would inevitably give way to unshackled capitalism, where environmental catastrophes would increase in size and frequency, causing mass diasporas of people seeking refuge or living as nomads. It was a vision of mass inequality, where the masses live in squalor, inhabiting single cities the size of states, while privileged elites and corporate hierarchies reside in ivory towers of unimaginable height, where the state has either collapsed entirely or functions as naught but an arm of corporations, where America has ceased to exist and is now a series of environmental disaster clearance areas or corporate-controlled zones. Naturally, the 80s vision of the future doesn't quite line up with our own on a 1-to-1 ratio. As just one example, back then, Japan was seen as an upcoming global superpower and seemed to have a complete monopoly on computer and electronic innovation. To bring this full circle, that's why everything's usually in Japanese or in other Asian languages. Back in the 80s, partially because of the Red China scare, but also because of Japan's economic boom, Asia was seen as potentially economically ruling the world. And depending on how you look at the conflict between the US and China now, you might be able to make an argument we're still heading in that direction, but that's besides the point. Just as with fantasy, the derivative nature of the cyberpunk genre allows it to assume that the reader knows what kind of world they're stepping into when they crack open a book or press the play button. It presupposes the audience knows it will be submerged in a world full of neon-lit, rain-drenched, always night cities with seemingly no end to them. Of cybernetics and aerodynes and warring gangs and corpo soldiers, of oppressive systems of power, end-stage capitalism, mass inequality, poverty, and desperation. As evidence of this, how many works think of that definition? I see this inherently derivative nature of cyberpunk not as shackles, but as a kind of liberation. Much like with fantasy, cyberpunk has the unique ability to both build upon and deconstruct its tropes and narrative presuppositions. Take Mr. Robot as a prime example of cyberpunk in the modern age. Or perhaps put more aptly, the age of cyberpunk beginning to come true. Our age. So, turning on the news seems awfully strange nowadays, doesn't it? We've seen this all before. In pandemic movies, or dystopian thrillers, or in cyberpunk. Although there is significantly less neon around than we might have hoped, we are living in the time of late-stage capitalism. Go on Reddit for 2 seconds and you'll find someone posting a clip of civilian medics being beaten and black-bagged by anonymous armed men in Portland, or of streets filled with mask-clad, scared people forced to go to work at the risk of their own lives. Somebody is bound to have commented on one of these posts with Cyberpunk AF every time. Our Talsorian Games recently posted on their blog in response to the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, so many others, and the brutal police response to what were peaceful protests. Quote, Mike spent a lot of time in the past few days, reflecting not just on current events, but a lifetime spent being a Black person in the United States and a Black person in gaming. Not to mention what it means to look out your window and see too much of the dystopian future you've made a career of writing become the dystopian present. They go on to say, we don't just condemn racism, we despise it. People, no matter the color of their skin, their gender identity, their sexual preference, their ethnicity, their physical and mental differences, their age, or their religion, have a right to live their lives without worrying about being harassed or beaten or killed by others, especially others with power and authority. When power is abused, people have the right, and in fact the duty, to stand up, protest that abuse, and demand accountability. In the words of Mike Pondsmith, Cyberpunk was a warning, not an aspiration. Conclusion. I find comfort in Cyberpunk, the same way I find comfort in playing Pathologic during a global pandemic. It feels somehow cathartic to submerge myself in a version of real events that I can digest and understand as art, and go on to process the real thing as it's happening today. At its core, Cyberpunk is not about cybernetics and neon. That may be dope, and it may be a huge part of the setting, but it isn't the story. Despite all of its cynicism, Cyberpunk is at its core about the outcast, the poor, the addicted, the strange, the differently abled, people of color, queer people, isolated people. It's about individuals from all walks of life, downtrodden and different, banding together to fight back against power because they're stronger together than they are on their own, or fighting against each other. Cyberpunk heroes are never the chosen one. They're the people struggling to make rent. They're facing discrimination, hopelessness, and struggle, and they are on the run from forces who want to silence them. We may be living in an era closer to Mr. Robot than Blade Runner, but the message is the same. If we're living in a cyberpunk world, then maybe we should start thinking and acting like a cyberpunk hero. Thanks for watching. Thanks for watching. I'm definitely gonna cover a lot of the stuff that I kind of brushed on in this one in the future, but I think this was a pretty good start. So yeah, if you like what you see, subscribe. I don't really know how this whole YouTube thing works yet. I just want to make some cyberpunk shit. So yeah, well, thanks for stopping by. Stay healthy, stay safe, fight the machine, and have a fantastic fucking day, evening, morning, whatever. it's like 11 where I am right now, and I have to be up at work at 4:30, so wish me luck.